All right. Well, I think we're as assembled as we're going to be for the last panel for now. My name is Maggie Siegel D'Amico. I'm a partner at Cravath here in New York in our antitrust practice group, and I've got a great set of panelists right here to present and comment on different topics. So this session is digital privacy, and I think more generally speaking, digital privacy issues and the regulation of digital privacy. Obviously, the implementation of GDPR has really transformed the landscape. And so because of that, though, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And there are lots of implications, both intended and unintended, because of that in the transformation of the digital privacy landscape. So we've got a number of folks to go, and we know this is the last one, and we're starting a little bit late. We're going to try to still end at 5, but if we push back that a little bit, we know that there's a reception afterwards, and we don't want to get too much in the way of that. Presenting first is Yafit Leveretz, who is the Assistant Professor of Law at the Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College, who will be discussing privacy regulation and innovation policy and the interaction between those two. And we have Rob Siemens, who is the Assistant Professor of Management and Organizations at the Stern School of Business here at NYU. I'll run through all the names after that. Bebe Lei, who's here on the list, couldn't make it with travel issues from China. So we have Meghna,
Yep.
One of the co-authors of the paper that she wrote on the perils of location tracking, personalized and interpretable privacy preservation in consumer mobile trajectories, here to discuss that paper. The discussant for that presentation is Jason Chan at the end of the table here, who's the Associate Professor of Information and Decision Science at the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. Finally, for the last presenter, we have Priyanka Sharma, who is the Assistant Professor of Economics at the Stewart School of Business at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. And the discussant for her presentation is Yanis Bakos, who is the Associate Professor of Information Systems here at the NYU Stern School of Business. Finally, we have Divya Mathur, who's here from Analysis Group in Chicago, who will be the overall discussant for all of the information we'll be going through today. No small task. So first, I'll turn it over to Yafit to go through her presentation.
Literally go over the presentation.
You know how technology always doesn't work in technology conferences? Let's hope that's not going to be the case. Can you hear me?
No.
Case in point. Is it working now? Yeah? Okay. Tall people's problems. Okay, so hello everybody. I want to thank the organizers for this important conference and for having me. Kathy Strandberg, you've met her already, and I have been working on this paper for about 2.5 years. We started working on this paper because we were troubled by this all too common claim that privacy regulation will stifle innovation. So we shouldn't regulate. We were troubled because we care about privacy. But we were also troubled because we felt that this statement is simply counterproductive and unhelpful. It is very sweeping. It lacks contextualization. It's not nuanced. And it often comes from players with very high stakes in the game. And as academics, we all know these are very good reasons to be skeptical. And these reasons drove us to take a deep dive into this topic and hopefully come up with a better understanding of the privacy regulation and innovation dynamics. So, before mapping out the relationship between regulation and innovation, I want to set the ground by explaining what we mean by privacy and how we define innovation. For the definition of privacy, we're both enthusiastic subscribers of Helen Nissenbaum's contextual integrity theory, which moves away from traditional views of privacy as secrecy or as control, and equates privacy to appropriate information flows. and information flow is deemed appropriate based on social and ethical norms and users' reasonable expectations. As for innovation, we define it kind of broadly as any novel aspect of goods, services, or their production that provides a competitive advantage. Innovation, importantly, is not a commodity. Measuring innovation is a difficult, some would say impossible, undertaking. But even more to the point, to scrutinize innovation activity, we need to look at the innovation portfolio that the market produces. We also assume that competition best fosters innovation, even though we know that to some this is a contested view, especially in the antitrust literature. But we side with this approach, which is also echoed by the majority of IP scholars. And now to the argument. The analysis is quite complex, so the deal is I'm going to try to simplify it, and you're going to try to bear with me. We start by looking at two forces that shape market incentives for innovation: the demand signals perceived by potential innovators, and the extent to which those suppliers expect to appropriate market returns from particular innovative avenues. Failures of perceived demand are instances where apparent consumer demand for some socially valuable innovations, defined broadly, is absent or too weak for various reasons. And we go over those reasons in the paper, such as positive externalities, collective action problems, and so forth. This kind of failure is commonly addressed by traditional regulation. In this sense, we agree with those saying that regulation stifles innovation. In fact, it is exactly what the regulation is intended to do. In this sense, regulation, Kathy likes to say, is a feature and not a bug. So, regulation obviously has costs. Transaction costs, badly designed regulation has costs, and regulatory capture. But our policy approach includes various ways of mitigating those costs, such as through expert agencies, cost-benefit analysis, and notice and comment. At the end of the day, we regulate. We don't have perfect results, but we continue to regulate, such as in the case of health and safety and environmental regulations, probably because failures to regulate are also, and perhaps even more, socially costly. Failures of appropriation, on the other side, appropriability, occur when suppliers have incentives to distort the market's portfolio of goods and services away from what the market would otherwise demand by shifting production toward those goods and services that allow them to appropriate higher market returns. These appropriability failures can materialize even in the face of demand signals that are perfectly aligned with social preferences. Examples of such failures include the famous free rider problem, which is addressed by IP law, providing period of exclusivity, and barriers to entry, which is addressed by antitrust and competition law. Now, IP exclusivity is also socially costly, but this is why we have limiting doctrines such as non-obviousness and disclosure requirements in patents, and excluding reverse engineering and independent invention from trade secrecy violations. Here, I also want to mention that there are also natural barriers to competitive entry, which also distort the appropriability landscape and the innovation portfolio, such as network effects, that are not well addressed by IP law or competition law. And we'll get back to that, so that's kind of a spoiler. So to recap, the important point to make here is that overall, the market portfolio of goods, services, and innovative activities is jointly elicited by suppliers' perceptions of market demand, which may be shaped by regulation, and their expectations about appropriability, which may be shaped by intellectual property and competition law. While the regulatory policy literature has addressed market demand failures, and intellectual property and competition law literature have addressed failures of appropriability, the interplay between market demand failures and appropriability failures has been underappreciated, and this is where we find the major contribution of this paper. Now, the second point is that claims about stifling innovation through regulation usually reflect concerns about innovation's path dependence and unpredictability and the cumulative nature of innovation. But the uncertainty argument is not a strong argument because a failure to regulate leaves us at a state of failure of perceived demand and suboptimal innovation portfolio. In other words, regulation has costs, but so does not regulating. Now to privacy. So we assume, based on more than enough evidence, that market demand in personal information markets is misaligned with social value for various reasons that we explain in the paper. We also believe that well-designed privacy regulation can effectively mitigate those failures and realign demand with social value. So far, this sounds like any other market. But personal information markets do exhibit some unique characteristics that may extend the effect of privacy regulation beyond realignment of market of demand signals with social value to mitigating some of the appropriability failures. First, in personal information markets, natural barriers to entry are often large due to network effects and data aggregation effects. Now, by network effects, we refer to cases in which the value for each user goes up as the number of users go up. This is true for what today we consider to be kind of old school innovation, like the telephone network, but also for newer innovation, like social networks, right? It makes no sense to be on a social network if you don't have a mass of other people that you can connect with. So the more people you have, the higher the value for you as a user. By data aggregation effects, we mean that the value for each user goes up with the amount of collected data. So it doesn't specifically tie to the number of users, but to the amount of personal data collected. This effect is common, for example, for search engines. Second, when it comes to personal information-based innovation, free-riding problems are often small or non-existent because personal information databases are usually guarded as trade secrets and are hard or impossible to copy. And third, and directly following up on this, trade secrecy limiting doctrines lose much of their effectiveness in PI markets because reverse engineering is difficult or impossible. And independent invention is costly for the second mover, while the first mover often acquires the data as a byproduct of another product or service that was offered. So what we see here is that in personal information markets, the usual assumption of separability between regulatory design and innovation may not apply, and that well-designed privacy regulation, in such case, can not only realign the market's innovation portfolio with actual market demand and social value, but also shift innovation away from areas with appropriability problems. And this is, my friends, some context on how privacy regulation and innovation policy interact. In earlier versions of this paper, we titled it Better Together, Privacy Regulation and Innovation Policy. For reasons I'm sure you can all understand, we got rid of the better together part, but we truly believe that they are better together. Thank you. Just, do you need help with it?
Now,
Sorry.
hi, everybody. What do I do
This is on the
here?
browser, so you just
Okay.
go down.
So can I
just-
kill this?
You can minimize it. 'Cause
Oh,
other
this.
things
Oh,
that are
okay.
not
Got it,
fine.
got it, got it.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, where? Okay. There we go. There. And here we go. There. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Siemens. I'm a professor at the business school, and so my comments might, or for sure, are going to reflect the fact that I'm at a business school, and that is intentional. Because Danny, and I don't know if Danny is back in the room, but he intentionally told those of us that are from, not from a law school to really try to play up the interdisciplinariness that we bring to this conference. So I love this paper. I think this is a really good paper. I've seen a prior version of it, or I don't know if it's a prior version or maybe a companion paper that I've seen earlier. I really like the work that this co-author team is doing. At its core, the way I see what they are doing is bringing a lot of clarity to a debate that I think has probably been intentionally muddied, right? And the debate is around privacy regulation and effects on innovation. And the core point that I think that the co-authors are making are that these are two important issues, but in many cases can be separated. We can separate out privacy regulation, and we can separate out competition policy and sort of appropriability and all of those types of things. So I think I think just clarity around the fact that we can separate those out is important. But I think that there's more to it than that. I think that by separating the two out, one of the things that the co-authors have done is create a sort of framework that and I'm going to use the term framework a few times. Again, this is sort of the business school lingo here. They've created a framework that I think is really useful for assessing different types of policies. Okay? Now, in the paper itself, so in the presentation, I think intentionally perhaps because of time, you didn't go into a whole lot of detail around policies. But one of the nice things about the paper, one of the things that I like a lot about it, is that the authors go through several different policies. And they do it as a way to sort of show you the value of the framework that they've created. But I think there's also perhaps a hidden agenda there, which is that some of these policies are really quite good policies that people should be discussing, or sort of general public should be discussing in more detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly sort of recap some of the policy work that they do in the paper, and then I'm going to sort of zoom out and talk a little bit more about things at like a little bit more of a macroeconomic point of view. And all of this is just meant to be sort of food for thought. Okay? Okay, so here's the policy comparison, and this is in the last section of the paper. The authors consider 3 different policies. Okay, this is in that first column over there. There's restrict retention of search engine data, restrict collection of data, and mandated data sharing. Okay? The way I think about the first one is it's sort of analogous to like a patent, right? The idea is you get data, and you get a monopoly on that data, and then after a certain amount of time, and they say 2 weeks, but that's just a parameter. We could make that a year. We could make that 10 years. We could make that 2 months. Right? It's just a parameter. We can adjust that depending on what we think are the costs and benefits and different trade-offs. But it's sort of like a patent, right? You have access to that data, and then after a certain amount of time, you no longer have a monopoly on that data, right? That data gets deleted. So that's sort of policy number 1. Second policy is restrict collection of data. This is basically like GDPR or something like GDPR. And then the third is mandated data sharing. So I think of this as basically like data portability. Okay? Now, I use some different terms there. The authors might quibble with them, but that's sort of the way that I think about these policies. So what is it that their framework does? Their framework takes these 3 different policies and assesses them along these 2 different dimensions. One dimension is the privacy regulation dimension, and then the other dimension is, if you will, like the competition policy or appropriability dimension. Now, I'm not going to, you can read the paper to sort of go through all the sort of nuanced and well thought out arguments that the authors make on this. I'm not going to do that. But what I am going to point out is that one of the things that I like that the authors do, and this is sort of more when talking about the competition policy side of it, is they talk about the heterogeneous effects of these different policies on firms. Okay, and in particular, sort of playing up some of the differences across large firms versus small firms or entering firms, with one of the key ideas being that to the extent that the policy allows or sort of stimulates more competitive entry by innovative new firms, that will either push the incumbent firms to innovate more, or just in and of itself will bring more innovation into the market. And on net, now of course this is something that would have to be sort of assessed, but on net you would expect that that should lead to better outcomes. The one little quibble that I have is on the last one, the sort of data portability one. I agree that it would help to level the playing field. My quibble is that it would level the playing field more among sort of incumbent established firms, it doesn't necessarily do much to encourage entry by new firms. This is perhaps selfish, but I'm citing some of my own work here. It is unselfish, though, in that I'm citing a co-author who happens to be an NYU Law School alum. Okay, so that's my nod to my hosts here. So as you go through, as you use this framework to sort of assess the policies, now I'm going to use colors because I know it's the end of the day. Green is good, red is bad. You start to sort of stack these up, and it looks like the top one is better than the second one and the third one. This wasn't a surprise to me based on my knowledge of some of the prior work that the co-authors have done. Now, again, coming from a business school, I like to simplify things down. That's because the audience that I speak to is perhaps not as sophisticated as the audience that law schools speak to. However, the audience that I speak to ends up being CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and they are the bosses of the audiences that you guys speak to. And so this is sort of comment number one, which is that I think you can do a lot with this framework, this sort of focusing on privacy and focusing on appropriability. And I think one of the ways you could do this is by, so this is sort of, right, this is sort of from the paper. It's sort of looking at each of the policies and sort of assessing them on different dimensions. A different way to do it is to focus instead on the dimensions, which is what we're doing here. Okay, I've now created this 2x2 space, right? This is my framework now. This is my 2x2 space, okay? Where I'm thinking about, so along the y-axis, it's the competition policy dimension, and along the x-axis, along the x-axis is the competition policy or appropriability dimension. Along the y-axis is the privacy dimension. And then within this space, you could then take any given policy and sort of situate it to get a sense of which of the policies are best, right? So this is sort of the 2x2 space. Now, again, speaking about business schools, so and CEOs and reaching CEOs, I think with a framework like this, I think you guys for sure have a paper that would, it will be in a top law school journal. There's no question about that. But there might be other audiences, and I think this is the type of thing that actually, you could write a companion piece perhaps for the Harvard Business Review, so that you could, mental note, right, so that you could reach the future bosses of all the lawyers. Okay. So that was sort of that's sort of assessing the policies and thinking about the framework that you guys have created. Now, just a couple of high-level thoughts, and this first one is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely. So let's focus on this restrict data retention, right? So this is sort of use then delete would be the policy. Now, one question is, well, what about big tech, right? Are they going to be happy with this? You might think no, they're not going to be happy with this. But actually, according to everything that they've said, they'll be just fine with it, okay? A lot of the research coming out of big tech companies, so this is research that comes out of Amazon, says that data, having more data, does not give them an advantage. It does not give them a competitive advantage. And this is their proof of it. This is, you can think of the y-axis as a measure of performance. The x-axis is more data. You see how that performance line, initially maybe it matters, but then it plateaus very quickly. And so let's imagine deleting data, going from the right and erasing data, going to the left. It's not going to hurt them. Okay? So a beauty of this, again, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I'm sure they're going to hate your policy. Okay? But all of the research that they've done has suggested that it will not hurt them. No, I'm serious. All the research that they've done has suggested it will not hurt them. I don't know if you want to bring this up in the paper, but I think it's an interesting point to consider. 2 more slides, then I'm done. So you start off the paper, rightly so, I think, saying that the information economy is important for economic growth. This is the contention or the argument that's out there, which is why we want to be careful with privacy regulation, right? Again, that's how the talk was motivated, that's how the paper is motivated. Again, this is food for thought. So if that's true, then why is it, right? I mean, and obviously information economy has become, the firms that produce or sort of populate this sector of the economy have become more and more important over time. And yet it's not as if we've seen a boost to productivity, right? We are in a period of declining productivity growth. We are in a period of declining economic growth. Our economy is growing, but not at the rate that it used to. And so all of this seems to suggest that actually whatever argument it is that's being made that this sector of the economy is so important, you need to, not you guys, but like the folks making that argument actually need to grapple with the facts, which is that it doesn't seem like our economy is actually doing that great. Okay, so that's that one. And then the second piece is that, so there are many economists that are concerned that we are in a period of, we're in a period where across many different industries and across many different countries, where there's increasing concentration, right? So there are now fewer firms that are controlling larger and larger segments of the economy. There are many pieces of evidence that one could point to for this. It is a little bit contentious, but there's many pieces of evidence that one could point to. One piece of evidence is looking at markups and how markups have changed over time. So a markup is just simply the difference between price and cost, okay? And if there's a lot of competition, you would expect that those rents, if you will, those economic rents would be competed away, okay? And those markups should go down. Over time, those markups have increased, okay? So that would, again, suggest that we have a competition problem, right? That there are not enough firms entering and competing away these profits. And moreover, in particular, by the way, this comes from the IMF, in particular, it is those, this is what's in blue, it's those sectors of the economy that are sort of ICT intensive, right? Precisely the sort of information economy type firms. Again, it's an excellent paper. I felt like my role was to provide a little bit of context and a little bit of food for thought. I encourage everybody to take a look at the paper. Thank you.
Geo-privacy, the fourth one. Yeah. Hi all, I'm Meghnath. I'm a fourth year PhD student at Carnegie Mellon. And today I will be talking about the perils of location tracking. This is a joint work with Bebe from Carnegie Mellon, who unfortunately couldn't be here, and Natasha from University of Virginia, who's presenting the paper at Melbourne currently, and Anindya from New York Stone, who's here. So I'll start off by talking about the two key contributions that we make with this work. So the first key contribution is that we develop a novel privacy-preserving mechanism that maximizes an advertiser's return with limited consumer personal information. So fundamentally, the privacy-preserving mechanism that we develop has three components. The first component is where we try to understand and quantify the cost of sharing the location data for a consumer. And the second component is where we try to understand and measure the benefit that an advertiser would get when they acquire this location data from the data collectors or the consumers. And finally, in the third component, we develop an algorithm which would trade off the consumer privacy cost and the advertiser's benefit. And the developed privacy-preserving mechanism, we validate this on around 40,000 fine-grained consumer GPS location trajectories. And these consumers were from a northeastern city in the United States, and the data set that we work with is from 2018. So moving on, I'll talk about the current status quo of the mobile economy and location tracking. Mobile phones and location-based services have fundamentally changed the way we live lives. We use our mobile phones to do a lot of things. We wake up in the morning, we check the weather, we take an Uber ride, we are looking for local deals or local restaurants. And one fundamental thing that ties all these use cases that I just talked about is that whenever we want to use this service, we as consumers need to share our location with the application developer, right? So that is the thing that ties in all these use cases. So around 70% of us, the people who are using the mobile applications, actually open the applications for more than 100 times in a day, according to a recent report. And around 90% of the US smartphone users use at least one sort of a location-based service on their mobile phones. While while the adoption of consumers is one catalyst of this mobile economy, another entity or another factor which is fueling this economy is the ease through which a data collector could collect this location data from the consumers. So on both the mobile operating systems, the popular mobile operating systems, Android as well as iOS, it only requires a single consumer permission from the consumer for the data collector to start collecting the location data. And apart from the GPS locations, that is the latitude and longitude, a data collector could very easily collect a series of other things as well. So it could be the speed at which you're traveling while using the mobile phone. It could be the distance to the nearest Wi-Fi wireless connection that your mobile phone is connected to, and also the timestamp at which this particular location is being tracked, and so on. So as a result of this rise in consumer adoption and the ease at which a data collector can track the consumers who are using this location-based services, this has opened up $1 billion opportunity for the advertisers who would be interested in acquiring this behaviorally rich location data for the purpose of targeting these consumers with personalization so as to gain monetary benefits. So a recent article in New York Times says that it only costs around half a cent to 2 cents for an advertiser to acquire a user's month-long location data. When advertisers acquire this location data, simplistically, an advertiser could either play the role of a butler who understands the needs and privacy concerns of the consumers and target them with relevant advertisements. However, a few advertisers could go overboard with the collected or acquired location data and become outright stalkers of the consumers. So the butler attitude of advertisers is often beneficial, like recent research has pointed out that it is often beneficial for the consumers. Consumers get better financial incentives as well as better personalization when they opt in to share their location data with an advertiser with a butler attitude. But however, there are also some advertisers that could take the form of stalkers who resort to invasive marketing techniques where they're trying to identify sensitive information such as home address or work address from your location data. So recent research also points out that consumers are willing to opt in to share their location data for all the incentivized offers that they expect from, let's say, an advertiser of a butler type. While this all seems very nice for the advertisers that they're getting this behaviorally rich information, there have been numerous concerns regarding the use, rather the misuse of the location data. Another New York Times article recently pointed out that just the tracking of the location data could be a national security risk because they've identified this GPS location trajectories in some of these government buildings in Washington, D.C., and based on the identity of those location trajectories, they could kind of point out these individuals' home addresses as well as their working patterns and so on. So these concerns have also prompted responses from both the policy as well as an industry. For instance, from an industry perspective, both Apple and Google provide much more finer controls for the users or the consumers to decide when and whom to share their location data with. So with that as the motivation and also the background, what we do in this study is we try to understand if there is a mechanism where we can maximize the advertiser's return because the consumers are willing to share in their location data, but we want to curtail the stalker intent of the advertisers when they share this location data. So the problem can, again, as I said, be broken down into 3 things where we study what is the cost, the privacy cost of the consumer while sharing this location data, and what is the benefit for the advertiser when they acquire this location data, and if there is a satisfactory trade-off between this cost and the advertiser's benefit that a data collector who is collecting the data continuously from the consumers could possibly reach based on the algorithm that we develop. So first, to quantify the consumer cost in our mechanism, we we assign or quantify the consumer cost to indicate the success rate of a stalker advertiser in inferring a private information from the location data. So there are two types of very common risks that are involved when a consumer shares location data with a data collector or an advertiser. So first is the re-identification, where a stalker aims to infer a user's complete trajectory by only knowing a subset of these locations that a user has visited. So just by knowing a couple of locations, one could infer the entire location trajectory and then re-identify the whole individual. And then we also have sensitive attribute inference, where a stalker aims to infer a particular sensitive attribute, which could be a home address, a work address, or it could be age or demographics from the location data. And coming to the advertiser's benefit, we consider a popular business goal, which is the point of interest recommendations, where the idea is that an advertiser would want to use or leverage the historical user preferences, that is, in our case, the historical locations visited by a user, to try and predict where they're going to go in the future so as to target them and personalize their experience on applications. And in our mechanism, intuitively, we assign or quantify the benefit for an advertiser as the accuracy of predictions of a recommender model. And we posit that a higher or more accurate the predictions, the higher it would be beneficial for the advertiser. And finally, we like to balance the trade-off between the consumer cost and the advertiser benefit, we introduce a suppression scheme. So the suppression scheme, the broad idea is to selectively suppress a subset of locations from an individual's trajectory. So we introduce two parameters. One parameter controls the number of locations to be suppressed, and the other would control the identity of the locations to be suppressed. And again, the objective here is that by changing these parameters, we want to identify a trade-off between the consumer cost and benefit, right? So at a broad level, the search strategy starts off by noticing two corner cases where a complete suppression, meaning that all the location data of an individual is suppressed, then I'm sorry, there's a mistake. So a complete suppression would result in no benefit and no privacy risk, whereas a complete suppression, a no suppression would result in maximum advertiser benefit and a maximum privacy risk for the consumer. So reviewing for the agenda for the next few slides. So I'll talk about the data that we worked with, and then I'll talk about the results, and then I'll end it with a summary slide. So the data that we worked with, we partner with a data collector who provides location-based integration services for almost 1/5 of the US population. The location services are integrated into hundreds of mobile applications, and I'm pretty sure we are using those mobile applications right now. The location data is of a major mid-Atlantic metropolitan region. And on the right-hand side, on the top, I just plot one user's location data for the 5 weeks that we have. And as you can see, we are able to, we have very fine granular data there. And on the bottom table is the raw location data that we have. So in the first column, we have the unique user ID. So the user ID is something that is attached to a mobile device rather than a mobile app. So if a user has 3 or 4 apps that collect location data, then the data collector is able to aggregate all these locations from the 3 or 4 apps to get a much more holistic view of the consumer's location history. And then we have the platform, which would tell us whether it is iOS or Android, the operating system. And then we have the exact GPS location and latitude. And then the country, which is primarily US in our case, and the speed at which a consumer is traveling, and altitude at which the consumer is traveling. And then we also have the timestamp. And then we also have the device model, which is the phone model that you have. And we also have the decoration of that particular latitude and longitude, which could be the nearest restaurant or a nearest mall or even a nearest salon. So in total, we had around 40,000 consumers, which corresponded to around 940,000 observations over 5 weeks in 2018. And I've discussed about what each row of the observation has. And this is some of the summary stats we have. We had around 23.47 number of locations per user, of which 15 of them were unique. And we've tracked these users for around 270 hours, and people spent around 27 minutes at each location. So coming to the main results, so the first set of results I'll be talking about is when there is no suppression, as in there is no suppression scheme involved, as in just the raw location trajectory is shared with an advertiser, right? So we observe that there is an 82% chance of inferring a sensitive attribute if a stalker decides to infer the sensitive attribute, and the home address could be inferred within a 2.5-mile radius, and a stalker's success of re-identify a consumer's entire location history by only knowing 2 randomly visited locations of the user is around 49%. So these numbers are for the 40,000 users that we've analyzed. And since most of the quantification that we do in our method is at an individual level, a data collector would have the ability to assess the risk of each consumer by this simple histogram. And as you can see, a majority of the users are at a very high risk of their sensitive attribute being inferred. And the next result is about the suppression scheme. So the mechanism that we developed gives multiple options for a data collector to balance the trade-off between the consumer cost and consumer benefit. So on the x-axis is the decrease in the consumer cost from the baseline, as in when there is no suppression performed on the location trajectories. And on the y-axis, we have the decrease in the benefit. So an x equal to y line here would mean that there is an equal trade-off of cost and benefit for a particular suppression scheme. So a suppression scheme which would fall on this line is all right, but an ideal case would be this, where we decrease the consumer cost without trading off any of the advertiser's benefit. So the multiple options that our mechanism comes up with are closer to the horizontal line. And these results stand like even though we test for different use cases of the advertiser. Like all of the slopes are lesser than 1. So it means that we're trading off lesser of the advertiser's benefit for a higher decrease in consumers' privacy cost. So summarily, we develop a privacy-preserving mechanism where we try to ensure that an advertiser would get maximum benefit while reducing the consumer privacy cost. We provide multiple options from the mechanism, and we've also validated this framework on like real-world consumer trajectories. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, my name is Jason Chen. I'm an associate professor at University of Minnesota, Carlson School of Management. It's a pleasure to read and discuss this paper. It's a very well-executed paper for a couple of reasons. One, we could see very apparently that the topic here is one that is very, very meaningful, very interesting, because now we are seeing more and more of this data that's coming from mobile phones that could inform advertisers and practitioners about where users are. And such things are coming in troves and could be actually available from a very low cost. And using this sort of information, attacks could be performed, right? But at the same time, there's sort of new studies that has shown that such data can be actually very useful for business purposes, right? Based on the past study by Anindo and Bebe, they've seen that using such data, they could target customers more effectively and hence lead to sort of better outcomes for the consumers. So how do we sort of strike a right trade-off and a right balance between using this data and at the same time protect the interests of consumer? So that's the sort of main thing that this paper tries to achieve by producing a solution that meets the consumer in the middle ground, right? For them to share data in a way that's safe, and at the same time, advertisers could use it in a meaningful fashion, right? We see that as an inherent tension over here. This is a hard problem, and the authors here are trying to come up with a good solution to fix that, right? And I also like this paper because it has sort of a very comprehensive view of the situation, looking at both the interest of the advertiser, that from the users, and also they try to model, what a hacker would do in different scenarios, okay? So very, very comprehensive. That's why I think it's very well thought out in that fashion. At the same time, they're not just building a theoretical model to give us some, okay, this is probably some things that might happen, but they actually use real data, real world data, to actually validate their model, to train a model, to come up with the right sort of insights. And then finally, if you were to go into the details of this paper, and I would strongly encourage you to do so, you find that there's a lot of technical depth in what they're trying to do in this paper. Consider a variety of cases. The performance is truly impressive when they sort of compare it to different past models. So what I have in this discussion, I'll keep it really, really short because of the interest of time and the fact that this is really a good paper. What I do have here is just some possible ways to extend what they're trying to do over here and to improve on sort of broader scenarios, right? So the very first comment that I would have is that, privacy risk could mean different things for different people, right? In the case that, in the author's case, they have discussed using the test case of using inference of the home address and also inferring sort of the OS that the mobile system is using. But if we could recall, there's this old story from a few years ago. There was this teenager, for one sudden day, she's living with her parents, and then she's receiving all this sort of targeted emails from Target for newborn babies. And then what really happened for that situation was that Target actually was tracing that users' past purchase behavior, and then predicted that this young lady, this teenager, is actually getting pregnant. And hence, to get this person to buy more of their products, they actually send out coupons for baby products. And the father actually saw this mailers coming in saying, how could this be possible? My kid is just 16 years old. How could she be pregnant? But then it turns out that Target was right. They did a very good job at predicting that the kid was pregnant, and hence lots of these coupons for baby lotion was already sent. So if you were to consider such users out there, privacy to them is not just figuring out the home address, but the fact that what they bought, even the places that they have visited, could be something that's of privacy risk to them. In the sense of, if you look at if you have people visiting STI, testing clinics, which you want that to be sort of being made known, right? If you have visited, abortion clinics, right, like districts for, businessmen, or even casinos, you wouldn't want your, spouse to know that you've been visiting casinos at a high frequency. So what I would, think that's, is a good thing to add to this very fabulous algorithm is that for some of these sensitive locations out there, which they have called as the point of interest, might need to be sort of removed or sort of censored out, because it could be sensitive, it could be sort of clashing against, the privacy risk that individuals have in such context, right? The second thing that I would sort of want to know more about is to provide some more details on how, because in this presentation that McNutt gave, he didn't actually have time to go into obfuscation, but in the paper he actually did talk about it. So by sort of changing some of these values, by not showing certain locations, or even replacing it with other locations, that could sort of help to mask some of these locations, right? But then what is sort of the ideal level of mixing that up, right? If you were to give a wrong value to the advertisers, they bought it, and then they think that that's actually the correct one, they could sort of make the wrong inference and then bring out the wrong set of ads to the users. So what is the right threshold? What is the right level that they could sort of use so that you don't get advertisers to the wrong spot? I think that's another important thing to sort of think about and to make sense of. The third and fourth sort of point over here relates to the fact that what we see over here in this paper is that they have come up with a very good technical solution. But for myself, I work mainly in the field of economic policy and also to derive the causal impact of sort of technology. So one of the things that I would want to see in this paper is can we sort of get a value of this algorithm, right? If we were to sort of implement it in practice, if we were to say have the policymakers put it out in an actual rule, in an actual law, to get every sort of data dealer, data broker to sort of enforce this by using this algorithm, can we show what is the actual welfare, right, to the users themselves and to the advertisers, right? And to actually show that in a meaningful and causal fashion, there's a need to sort of run an actual experiment. have a group of users out there, randomly chosen, to adopt this algorithm, and then another set of control users that do not have that. Let them use it for a period of time, say 6 months, a year, and then we would track, what is the sort of additional sales that's being generated based on this geo-targeted ads. So that way we can see is there sort of real value to the advertisers. And at the same time, we want to also check on the users to see, how concerned they are sort of in sharing this data with the advertisers. Do they have, does this sort of algorithm helps to prevent that? So with that, we can sort of come to a clear conclusion that this is of actual economic value, and hence, we can push this research forward and say, let's put it in practice, let's put it in the law, right? The last sort of recommendation is pretty much a extension of the third recommendation, is that we know that there's already a very basic system out there, an opt-in and opt-out system where users could say, I don't feel comfortable sharing my location data with advertisers, let's just take it out. So by having this new algorithm, we want to also go in further and say that how much better is this current algorithm doing than the opt-in and opt-out system. And now we do not know what is sort of the sensitivity in terms of the users, variance and heterogeneity. So there's a need to sort of dig in deeper into that to see, like, okay, is there truly sort of enough variation that, users, they want to sort of have a more final breakdown of say, okay, let's mask some of these locations randomly or in a systematic fashion so that it does better than the opt-out sort of system out there, right? And again, I think this is, to convince practitioners, to convince lawmakers to make this really happen in the real world. We need to show this actual economic value, right? So with that, I conclude my sort of recommendation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jason, and thank you, Meghana, for stepping in on this. It's interesting, I mean, when thinking about the first two presentations we've sent, the commonality I see across them is, we're talking about things either that are or have said to be in tension with each other when we're talking about privacy, whether it's regulation of privacy and innovation, or whether we're talking about, privacy, actual privacy of people taking your data and using it versus the benefit to advertisers. And it was interesting, what jumped out at me of those first two is that there doesn't, at least from the studies, it doesn't appear to be a one-to-one ratio between the cost of either the regulation or in terms of cutting back on the collection and the retention of data and the benefit to privacy. It's not like you drop one down by one and the other goes up by one, that there is, I think we saw it in two different charts, the lines curve out like this or kind of curve up like this. And so clearly what it shows is there is a way to cut back, and I'll say on the margins, that might be a little bit too extreme, but there is a way to cut back around the edges in terms of the data that's being collected and how it's being used, while benefiting privacy even more. As a practitioner, the one thing that I think of as that's being discussed is, but what happens when we factor in the cost of implementation? How does that push us over the edge? Does it push us up to one-to-one? Is that still worth it? So I don't have an answer to that, but just thinking about, as someone who will get a question from my clients of, okay, this is all like well and good, but how do I comply with this regulation? How do I comply with this rule? And so that for me is the really interesting question of, clearly we see there is I say beneficial for privacy, thinking about, my own data being collected. Clearly there is a beneficial balance of some kind of regulation, of some kind of cutting back on the data that is being collected that benefits privacy generally. But how do we layer on top of that actually implementing whatever sort of regulation there is, and does that tip the balance? So with that comment, I will turn it over to Priyanka to present the last topic we've got.
Great, good evening, everyone. As the final presenter of the day, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our organizers one more time for organizing this wonderful conference and for including our paper here. So this paper, so far, since we have been
Okay.
So far, our discussion about this data regulation and privacy has been really focusing on consumers and markets, but one of the aspects of data regulation which was overlooked in today's discussion so far is election. So that's where me and my work with my co-author Liad Wagman is going to come in, that will talk about the privacy and data regulation sort of in contest, in the context of political contests. So this work of ours is sort of motivated by this observation, which probably all of you here are familiar with, that these data intermediaries are really becoming prominent players in today's world. So they have so much information about consumer transactions. So as a recent FTC report mentioned, that one data broker's database has information on 1.4 billion consumer transactions and over 700 billion aggregated data elements. Another data broker's database covers $1 trillion in consumer transactions. Another one includes 3 billion new records each month to its databases. So these intermediaries are really becoming super, super huge. And this sort of phenomena has been accompanied with a concomitant rise in political campaign spending. So in the most recent election, close to $10 billion were spent on campaign spending, and almost 15% of that money went towards digital advertising. Okay? Digital advertising on itself registered a growth rate of close to 800% compared to what the expenses were in 2012. So these sort of observations raise another sort of concern that these social media platforms, they are not just the recipients of these advertising dollars, they also are the creators of data which is accumulated by these data intermediaries. So these media platforms many times assist these data intermediaries in collecting information on various aspects, which essentially allows these data intermediaries to gauge voters' preferences and sort of identify how their preferences over the political candidates. So all of these observations have sort of stimulated an interest in understanding the links which are there between data intermediaries, between media platforms, which receive this money from campaign spending in terms of advertising dollars, and ultimately election outcomes. So that's what we are doing in this paper. So motivated by this setup, what we do is we theoretically study an election model where there are two candidates who are competing in an election, and they can convince voters to vote for them by spending campaign resources. Right? However, in our model, voters are already biased in the sense that voters already have sort of a favor for one of the candidates. What that means is that even if both the candidates spend same amount of money, they are more likely to vote for one of the two candidates. So voters are biased, and in that setup, we give the option to the political candidates to acquire some data through data intermediary, which is going to allow them or give them the option of knowing how biased are the voters, okay? So that they can target their spending accordingly, sort of drop their advertising accordingly, and increase the chance that these biased voters are going to vote for them. In that setup, we essentially asked two key questions. First one being, how candidates' access to this voter pertinent data alters these campaigning advertising expenditure. So how information, so the role of information is sort of altering these campaign advertising expenditure. And sort of since this is the last presentation and you might not want to pay attention for next 20 minutes, I'm just going to give you the results first and then give you the sort of more technical details of the model so that at least you get to know the main results. So the first result here is that the candidate's campaigning expenditure is really dependent on voters' predisposition. It really depends on how biased are the voters. And ultimately, it also depends on which all candidates have access to data. So it depends on whether both the candidates get access to data or only one candidate gets access to data. And even within that, is it that the candidate who is favored by by the voters is the one who gets the data versus the other one who is biased against gets the data. So campaign spending really depends on that, which is sort of not very surprising. But one of the things that we came across is that when both the candidates are offered equal access to data, then in expectation, nothing really changes. So as long as both candidates have equal access, either both get access or both do not get access, in expectation, nothing is going to change in terms of campaign spending. But yeah, once you make this information access more unequal, one of the candidates start having access and the other does not, that's when things start changing. Okay? So that was our first finding. And this finding, of course, has implications first for a social media platform, because in our setup, the social media platform is the one who is going to receive these campaign advertising expenditure. So how these social media platforms' profits are affected by this. Next, we wanted to look at how a data intermediary's profits are affected by candidates' access to data. Since this data intermediary is the one which is going to be the recipient of the revenues from the sale of data. And ultimately, the key question is, okay, how does this data access affects the election outcomes? Okay? So again, answer to all these questions is really, since campaign advertising expenditures are dependent on voters' predisposition and degree of data access, so everything else is dependent on that. Okay? So this debate is sort of going to help us in seeing, in formulating these regulation about the use of data within political contests. So far, while there are FCC regulations which regulate the advertising sale prices to political candidates, there is no governmental policy which regulates or governs the candidates' access to data. So based on our analysis, we hope to sort of guide some debate in that direction and sort of say what would be a good sort of data access policy which can be formed without affecting the election outcome, if that's what our interest is. Okay? So that was one thing that we did. And the second thing that we did is we compared and contrast the incentives of this data intermediary who receives revenue from the sale of data to the candidates against the incentives of the platform who is the recipient of this advertising revenue in terms of candidates' data access. And here is the interesting finding here, that when we compare these two incentives, we found out that the intermediary and the platform are always at conflict. It doesn't matter in terms of what is the voter's predisposition, but they are always at conflict in terms of candidates' access to data, which means if platform wants both candidates to have access to data, if platform's profits are maximized when both candidates have access to data, then for sure data intermediary will have an interest in selling data exclusively to one of the candidates. Okay? And the reason for this is fairly straightforward, that intermediary stands to benefit from sale of data. The sale of data generates maximum revenue when it creates maximum savings for the candidates. And when does it create maximum saving for the candidates? When their advertising spending is lowest. So when that advertising spending becomes lowest, that starts hurting the platform. So that's where this conflict comes in, that both intermediary and the platform are sort of after the same pie, which these candidates candidates have to split between the two parties. So, an immediate implication of this finding is that a social media platform, so for example, Facebook, in this setup, which is also a creator of data, will have incentives to hinder these intermediaries' access to data as well. It would not want intermediary to have as much access to data, again, because of this conflict between their preferred data regime. This also means that always, no matter what is the voter's predisposition, always either intermediary or platform will have an incentive to provide asymmetric data access to one of the candidates. Doing so, and when they do so, doing so will alter the winning outcomes. They will potentially alter the outcome of the election as well. So both these players have a potential of influencing the outcome of an election. Okay? So those are sort of the main findings of my paper. If we are low on time, I can stop here and just wrap up my presentation here. So I'm going to look at the chair for this. Do you want me to stop here? These are my main results. I've already discussed my main results. I can go into greater details if we have time.
I think we may want to keep going, given we've got just a little bit left, trying to still stop at 5.
Okay.
If there are more, if there are like a few highlights you can give, that would be.
Okay, so then I'm quickly sort of going to show you some more figures and sort of pictures, just sort of cementing the same idea. So as I said, we are looking at 2 candidates, Alice and Bob. They spend money. In our setup, without loss of generality, Alice is the favored candidate. The likelihood that she's going to win depends not just on the relative spending, but also on voters' predisposition, which is captured by this variable X. As I already mentioned, platform receives advertising revenue, while it's the intermediary who can sell information about X. So with the setup, we sort of compare these 4 different data regimes. 2 are non-exclusive access, basically the benchmark case being neither have access to data, and then a full data access setup where both have access to data, and then D&D, and basically asymmetry access. So first variable or first alphabet always denoting excess of data to Alice, second one always denoting excess of data to Bob. So with this was our sort of the first result. Candidate spending, of course, it depends on voters' predisposition. And notice what happens as soon as candidates have more information. They reduce their spending for lower values of X, which means if voters are more likely to vote for Alice, if it turns out, they just reduce their spending. Okay? But if it turns out that no, the bias is not so severe, the favorability parameter for Alice is not so strong, Bob also has a chance of winning, then the competition is more fierce, spending is much higher. Okay? So that's our first result. However, it turns out in expectation, as long as both candidates have same access to data, expected outcome stays the same, just because similar access does not really change their relative standing in the election, so it doesn't really change their expected spending, even though it changes the spending ex post once they have information. So it doesn't change anything in terms of platform, in terms of intermediary. Intermediary may prefer this data access, the sale of data, because that's how he makes money. So comparing the case when neither candidates have data to both candidates having data, intermediary would like that. Okay? What happens when the favorite candidate has exclusive access? Well, again, there is sort of this shift which happens. There is a reallocation of resources in order to ensure better returns. So candidates adjust their spending. Essentially, Alice lowers her spending for higher values of X, but really increases it for lower values of X. This result shows what happens if the underdog receives data. So in this case, actually, the interesting thing to see here is that when it turns out for lower values of X, when it turns out voters are really biased towards Alice, and Bob gets to know, yes, voters are so biased, he just gives up. He says, I'm not going to spend here. That's it. It's not worth any amount of money to spend here because there is so little return. Okay? So spending reduces at that point. Then he starts competing very vigorously for some intermediate values. And then again, if it turns out after acquiring data, Bob figures out, okay, now the bias is not that severe. So maybe I don't need to spend so much. Again, at that point, he reduces the spending. So essentially, Bob having data has a non-monotonic response on his spending. He increases his spending for some intermediate values of X, while for extremes, he just cuts it down. So given the spending, we were able to sort of look at expected spending. And the finding, as I told you, is that the platform really is interested in the expected spending. And that expected spending really depends on the expected predisposition of the voters. Okay? So if we consider a very simple model where all values of X are equally likely, Right? So a uniform distribution between 0 and 1, it turns out that candidate spending is maximized when Alice has exclusive access to data. But what happens if we just skew this distribution a little bit, where now lower values of X become slightly more likely? Okay? So then immediately we consider a beta distribution with parameters 1 and 3. Immediately it turns out now candidate spending is highest when both candidates have equal access to data. Again, we tweak this parameter a little more, and again, outcome changed. So one of the observations here was we couldn't really do a one-to-one match between the shape of the distribution and candidate spending. That is sort of non-monotonic again. So it really depends. We could find examples pretty easily where any regime can be advertising revenue maximizing from the platform's perspective. Same thing, so that allowed us to look at intermediaries' preferences. We could compare these payoffs, and what we found out when we could compare these payoffs for the intermediary and the platform is exactly this conflict between the two parties. So both platform and intermediary have ranking over these data access regimes, and these rankings are always mirror opposite. So if platform wants Alice to have exclusive access to data, intermediary never wants that. That's the least preferred outcome from the intermediary's perspective. So that's the main result. And the idea is they're sharing the same pie. They're sharing the money that candidates have in terms of campaign spending, which can be spent towards advertising dollars vis-a-vis buying data. Okay? So, and yeah, and then we talk about election outcomes, how election outcomes are changed. So candidate success to data has potential of altering the election outcome. So these graphs sort of show how election outcomes are changing. So if underdog obtains access to data, that's actually good news for Alice, because when values of X are really low, then there is a 100% chance that she's going to win, even if she spends something very little. Right? So this sort of raises the possibility that there might be situations where Alice might actually want Bob to have data because she knows that it's going to discourage Bob from spending any money and actually increase her chances of winning. So sort of we plotted the same thing and wanted to see how expected winning likelihoods change. And again, they turn out to be distribution dependent. And that's it. So I've already repeated these results. So thank you.
Thank you.
So when Danny Sokol asked me to discuss the last paper on a Friday, just before the reception, I was very excited. But seriously, actually, I really thank you for having me here, and I really enjoyed reading Priyanka's paper. I'm Yannis Bakos from the business school a few blocks away. Being this late and being this paper that comes from an economic modeling tradition with a lot of symbols, I'm going to kind of repeat what was just said and then kind of give you a little bit of a perspective or give you a summary of what's just said. So the setting here is that we have two candidates, A and B, and they try to convince the voters basically to vote for them, and the voters are susceptible to political advertising. So the more you spend on a voter, the more likely you are to get them to vote for you. But of course, the more your opponent spends on the voter, then the less likely they are to vote for you. And so they've created a mechanism where the first question is, how much would A and B spend in advertising in this type of setting? And then the second question that they look at is, the setting assumes that the electorate is predisposed favorably towards one of the two candidates, which basically means that they tend to ignore the messages that come from the underdog or from the candidate that they're less disposed towards. But we don't know what is the actual value of that predisposition, and this is what they denote by X. We know what is the likely what is the distribution, but we don't know is the audience 100% against B and for A, in which case actually it doesn't even make sense to bother to advertise, or is it somewhere in the middle when actually advertising can be productive for both of the candidates. So if they don't know that, they spend based on the expected value, but the question that Priyanka asked is what happens if we then get an intermediary that through polling, market research, observation, can tell you what is the value of X. And as kind of she said, and we'll kind of look at it again, this changes the outcome. And then, of course, what if not only the intermediary can discover the value of X, or the candidates can somehow purchase it from the intermediary, then what happens if the intermediary sells to only one candidate, what she calls the exclusive regime, or she sends to, or the intermediary sells to both candidates? What does it do for the profits of the intermediary and the profits of the advertising platform? And this is kind of the results that you saw. First of all, that's an important question. We know that political advertising online is becoming very significant, and it is actually driving, it's having effects. Priyanka mentioned that there was more than $1 billion spent in the last election on digital advertising. Google now has this transparency project where they track political advertising on Google's platform, and in the past year plus alone, before we even got seriously about the elections, there was about $180 million spent. Again, you can see top advertisers. The other thing that makes this paper relevant is that we're increasingly investing in understanding not only what is the predisposition of the voters, but also how persuadable they are. Because you may have two voters that they like one of the candidates better than the other, but what the X here really tells you is, are they going to respond? Can you really move them? And that is a very important question, and that is kind of part of what comes out of the analysis. So, first of all, let me say that the analysis is economic modeling, and you might say, how useful is that? And it is really, the benefit is it can help us understand what are the dynamics, what are the important things that we need to think about, and also it might be interesting to know that this whole type of modeling has been employed for more than 40 years for consumer advertising. And it has yielded some very interesting perspectives on proper advertising strategies for consumers. And it's only fitting with our candidates basically becoming products that we buy based on advertising to a large extent. We can now carry this analysis in the political domain. So in their model, you have the two candidates, A and B, and this variable X, which basically tells you whether how much more favorable you are towards A. And when X is small, it means that you really care about A, and you don't really believe B, and when X is 1, you are equally likely to believe either of those. And then when X is actually more than 1, then you're more favorable towards B. And in their analysis, they look at the case where A is the favored candidate. They ignore the case where B is the favorable candidate, the favored candidate, and that is without loss of generality. As I will kind of show you a little bit later, if it is B that is more favored than A, essentially what happens is a mirror image of what happens when A is more favored than B. And so, and just to kind of elaborate a little bit on this, if there are both voters that prefer A to B and voters that prefer B to A, you can address that. What you do is you look separately at the two subpopulations and pretty much you apply the model to the voters that prefer A, and then you kind of swap A and B, and you apply to the voters that prefer B. So that's not a loss of generality. And the way that advertising here affects the probability that a voter will choose one of the two candidates is using what is called the two-look contest success function, which was introduced again in the advertising literature almost 50 years ago. So there's a lot of validity. In advertising economics, a little bit more complex than this. It has indices and square roots and so on, but this is a good enough, actually, form for this purpose. And essentially what this tells you, it tells you that the voters are 1 over X, where X here is less than 1, so they are more likely to be favorable to messages for A. So think of it that B, if your X here is 1/2, what that tells you is that if A spends $1 on advertising on a voter, it has the same effect as B spending $2, because half of it basically the voters ignore. So they get some really interesting results. The first interesting result they get is that if both A and B have the same information, they will spend the same amount, which is, it may take a while to kind of to think about it. You would think that if I'm the least favorite candidate, why would I spend exactly the same as the most favorite candidate? So it turns out that you want to spend less, but because you're wasting, in a way, a lot of your advertising, it's kind of being ignored, then these two things cancel each other out, and you end up spending exactly the same amount as the favorable candidate. So B and A end up spending the same amount of money on advertising. And this changes, though, if only one of the two candidates knows the real value of X. So essentially what happens in that case is that the candidates that are informed, they don't spend too much if nature is favorable. So let's say if reality is good for you, if A is really favored, if your real X is close to 0, and nothing that B does is going to help A. A is not, if A knows that, they're going to spend basically the correct amount of money. They're not going to spend less money or more money than is correct. And this is kind of what drives this. So again, in this example, if you're trying to, I don't have a laser here, I guess, but essentially what happens in this scenario is that if nature is very favorable to A, actually A ends up raising the spending. And as Priyanka mentioned, is if nature is very negative for B, if nobody can be moved, everybody is already made up their mind, then B is not going to even bother spending. And that is kind of what you end up as a result. So the total spending may be reduced. This was the other kind of interesting implication. If you tell one of the two candidates what is the real value of X, they actually may decide that they need to spend less and they're still going to get a comparable result. In particular, that happens for B, if, where B is the underdog. If they have no chance to win, then they're not going to spend money advertising. And that's why actually B would, and A, they each individually would be willing to pay to learn what is the value for X, what is the actual favorability of the two candidates in the electorate. And that's what the intermediary does. These days, data brokers, intermediaries can predict with very high accuracy not only the political orientation, but also the persuadability. And so essentially what the intermediate here does is they can discover X and then sell it to the candidates. And as Priyanka pointed out, this creates a divergence of incentives because basically the scenario where the intermediary has valuable information are the scenario, the outcomes where you can use that information so that you don't waste your advertising. And so the intermediary the data broker likes to provide useful information, but that results in less advertising. So the advertising platform is not happy. And actually, those two effects exactly cancel each other out. So if the sum of the two is constant, maybe one implication is that you should have both the data discovery and the advertising to be carried by the same platform, which is sort of what Facebook does. Because then you avoid any frictions that are in negotiating. Like Priyanka mentioned in the paper that maybe the advertising platform is trying to pass laws that restrict the intermediary from collecting data. Now, if they're both owned by the same entity, that is an economy that goes, I guess, against antitrust. As I mentioned, the model assumes that this distribution is asymmetric, but actually it's pretty good also. The same mechanisms can be used to analyze symmetric distributions. So they look at what happens if X is uniform between 0 and 1, and these are the graphs that you saw. And the blue line basically shows how much each candidate spends if they both have the same information. So you notice that when X is 0, they both spend 0. When X is 1, they maximize their spending because this is the most persuadable voters. But you could apply the same model if the favorability is uniform in the whole range from 0 to 2. So if either candidate is likely to be the favored one, then you would just get the same model flipped around, symmetric, and the same type of thinking and analysis can be carried out. So I just want to mention that doesn't lose generality. This is not a problem with the paper. The other thing that would be interesting, I think, is, and the model can handle, is when you have very polarized distributions. And I think it would be interesting to contrast what happens as the persuadability of voters gets very polarized. Actually, it turns out that advertising goes down. Why? Because if nobody can be convinced, then basically nobody will bother advertising a lot. And so it would be interesting to look at how different distributions of the persuadability affect the outcome. The other extension that I think would be very interesting is right now the model that Priyanka presented treats the whole electorate as one agent that has this parameter X that we don't know. But we can go way beyond that with personalized targeting. I mean, in the model that Priyanka presented, the intermediary is really a pollster. Essentially, think of it, what they do is they poll, they do market research, and they figure out for the whole electorate what is the X. But I think what would be much more effective is if you could determine the persuadability of each voter. So if I have, 200 million voters, I can find out perhaps what is the X for each of them, and I can individually apply this model to target every voter with a different level of advertising. And I think that allows a lot of very interesting analysis, and it can lead to results. And it's not something that's hypothetical. Facebook is doing that. Again, Facebook can predict with very high accuracy both your political leanings and your persuadability. And Cambridge Analytica did that twice. They went beyond the Facebook data, but the point that I want to make here is that we don't need to apply this model to the electorate as a whole. We could apply it to every voter individually. Other questions that we could ask is, what happens in that case? What happens to the total spending? What happens to the different regimes where one of the parties has exclusive information? I think also another interesting possibility is that it's no more the case where the data broker or the intermediary sells the information as a whole or none at all. You can think a scenario where I would sell to candidate A a certain number of voters, the ones that are more likely to be influenced by his spending, and I can sell to candidate B another segment. And so that is again, an interesting question about what happens in these cases. And then also in this model, there was no budget constraint. advertisers or the candidates would spend whatever it takes, and maybe for some candidates that's a realistic model, but for most candidates there is a budget constraint. So you need to prioritize your spending, and again, this model can kind of provide us a way to analyze and come up with predictions for what would be the prioritization. Also, what if we have two platforms? It's not only Facebook. You could have Facebook and Google, for example, competing to provide advertising. What if we have two intermediaries? So what if the platforms also are different? One of them can discover X and the other one cannot. So all of these, I think, are interesting questions. Or what if they differ in their ability to target? What if one of them can target based on X for individual consumers, and the other one cannot target? They can just give you the X for the whole electorate. So I think it will be very interesting, again, to analyze all of these examples. So in conclusion, I think that this paper helps us understand how we want to invest both in eliciting voter characteristics and in advertising. This approach can be used for many questions that are becoming increasingly important. It's really well done. I mean, again, keep in mind this is a theoretical model, but it's a model that uses mechanisms that have been validated in the advertising field and can be used to analyze a lot of interesting questions, and all of these questions to follow up on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Priyanka, and thank you, Yanis. So I'll turn it over to Divya to wrap up with a few concluding thoughts, kind of pulling all this very interesting information together.
Thank you, Maggie. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Danny, for inviting me. I think my most important observation is that I'm the only thing standing between all of you and the cocktail, so I promise to keep this really brief. I'm an economist. I work at Analysis Group, which is an economics litigation consulting firm. Most of my work is in antitrust and competition, very much practitioner-driven, so I'll see, where these comments go. What I wanted to do, instead of commenting on individual papers, is maybe try to outline some overarching themes that I think emerged in all of the papers. Some of this might be forcing some themes, so hopefully the authors will bear with me. And as I said, I will keep this brief. So I think the first theme that emerged for me was that the context of this privacy regulation really, really matters. I think that matters for many reasons, but most critically it matters because individual preferences for privacy really vary, and the returns to businesses of data and information also really vary, and they're very context specific. And so I think the location paper actually illustrates that really well. If my data can disclose my home address within a 2-mile radius, my concerns about privacy may well be very severe. Now, if you could use some sort of suppression scheme and what's revealed is my general location, it allows me to get store coupons without revealing my home address, maybe my preferences now look very different. And so I think one theme here is that broad restrictions on all data collection may not be optimal. I think the context really should be considered, and sort of blanket or universal regulation could be costly, to Maggie's point about implementation, but also potentially not optimal and inefficient. The second theme, I think, is that, and it relates to the first, is I think the regulatory design is really critical. All of these papers, I think, are showing that creative, nuanced, careful regulatory design with a focus on the specifics can be extremely helpful. Now, we know that's difficult and time-consuming, and we know the challenges, but I think there are real benefits to that, and I think that's what some of these papers are demonstrating. The other reason that the regulatory design is critical, I think, is a theme throughout today, which is that regulation can have many adverse, unintended consequences. I think there were many examples discussed. I won't go through them. But for example, the paper on innovation and privacy, restrictions on collection of data may well reduce the likelihood of a data breach, but it may also deny new competitors and nascent entrants access to data. And that's a problem and potentially an unintended consequence. The last theme, and I promise it's the last, I think is an interesting one, and the way I see it is that privacy concerns are frequently characterized as this zero-sum game where the interests between the consumers and the platforms and the intermediaries are always at conflict. And I think one theme that I'm hearing today is that the incentives across the various stakeholders are not always misaligned. They may be in many instances, and regulation is important there, but they're not necessarily and universally and consistently misaligned. I think the voter data paper shows that really well because, there may be tensions between the platform and the data intermediary, yet the platform's incentive regarding advertising revenues and consumer preferences may actually be aligned depending on how the ownership structure is. And so, I think many of the other papers showed that too, so I won't go into those details, but I think the takeaway for me is that, developing frameworks wherein the specific ownership structure and the way the mechanisms are designed and the value that consumers place on the information and the returns that businesses and platforms earn, I think it's important to take all of those into account when we're assessing the practical implications of both policy and its implementation. There are drinks on the other side.
Only thing left is to join me in thanking everyone up here for their really good work.